Episode number 8 of the Onside CFL Fantasy Football Podcast. Happy Independence Day. July 4th is when this thing's being recorded. Our friends south of the border playing daily fantasy sports. Love them. Thanks so much for subscribing and listening. Revolution Engine, Lower Your Weapons, brings us in for the evening. As always, we're available on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. Dave Dawson, Dan the Stats Guy, Engineer Ben. No producer Dan tonight. Things have just gone mysterious. I think he must have, Dan the Stats Guy, taken a trip down to Vegas for the evening. Yes or no?
Well, or else maybe he was one of the people involved in the Duron Carter fireworks that ended up with the suspension. I don't know. Maybe that's where we can explain it, that maybe he, in all that fallout, ended up with a 1 week suspension from Jeffrey Orridge. Yeah,
the American viewers got a treat on the weekend. ESPN was all over that. The son of Chris Carter, as Rod Black loves to bring up again and again. Boy, what a scandal that turned out to be. 1 game suspension, I guess. We don't normally talk about day-to-day game stuff, but how do you feel about that? Is that enough, 1 game suspension?
Well, obviously, that's not going to affect things very well for this week, of course, in fantasy, as the Montreal Alouettes are on their bye week, but it'll be for the following week. We'll get to the injuries. One other big injury. The Alouettes are going to have a different look when we get to week number 4 without Carter in the lineup and S.J. Green. But we'll leave that to the injury part and also talking about the Alouettes to the next week's podcast.
Yeah, and in past weeks, if you missed a podcast, an episode in the past, we're now available. We have been available on YouTube. You can check out some of the past episodes there. Got a full show today. Got a lot of things to cover, some social media, an interesting Twitter exchange between somebody from the Alouettes, not Duron Carter, and a very popular media personality, as well as, some of the fantasy value players. A lot of injuries on the weekend, top performers, and a whole lot more. But even before that, we've had a lot of people when it comes to the subscriptions, the fantasy guide. We here at Onside Interactive have had a very successful launch over the past few months, and we'd love for you to be a part of it going forward.
We've helped some guys make some big money, and we'll get to that also in the social media segment, I believe, we're not going to tell you exactly who to start, but we're going to give you some pretty good ideas of how we see things. We kind of take a few days on the weekend and throughout the week before putting out the rankings. And one thing to those who are new subscribers or wondering whether they should subscribe or not, our rankings are going to be coming out usually late afternoon on the Tuesday before the games on the Thursday. It gives you a couple days to look over things before you set your lineups and allows you to decide whether or not we know what we're talking about. And the first 2 weeks, it seems like we've known what we've talked about. Go back to our past podcast. Last week, we said to load up on Calgary Stampeders. That paid off in a big way for a number of people. And in that opening week, we also did pretty well with that Ottawa-Edmonton game as far as certain players, including John White, who's fairly low on a lot of people's minds coming back from his injury. He made a lot of people money in that first week. So this week we're going to give you the idea of who to look for, and also in our weekly DFS rankings, $20 onsidecfl.wordpress.com. You can get on there, get your weekly rankings, and emailed right to your inbox and go from there as you set your DraftKings lineup and also your long format teams, whether or not you should sit or start a guy.
Yeah, we have your sits and starts, a lot of those coming up later on in the show. And we're growing here. We're expanding, even though we're down a man tonight. And Engineer Ben is also producer Ben. He's the guy playing in the song off the top of the show. We're looking to expand. We'd love for you to jump on board if you're interested in having your name mentioned on our podcast.
Yeah, if you're wanting to be a sponsor for us, send us an email, onsidepodcast@gmail.com. Maybe we can get some sort of an agreement where we can talk about your business or any different enterprise. We'll let you know what our sponsorship expectations are for that. But we're definitely looking for anybody that wants to jump on board as a sponsor.
Growing business. We got big things planned in the future as well. Very, very grateful. All of our new followers we have in the States. A big shout out to them and our usual subscribers we've had for years back to when we were a part of Rouge Radio. All right, Dan said business. Let's get down to business. And boy, were there a lot of injuries on the weekend? Were there not, especially in that Montreal game, which is exactly where we'll start? Tyrell Sutton looks like he's going to be going on the 6th game. I guess even before that, why don't we even start with the biggest one on Montreal before we get to Tyrell Sutton? SJ Green, he looks like that's going to be a big one to come back from.
That's a big, tough injury for him to come back, not only this season, but going forward. He tears his ACL, MCL, PCL, meniscus in his knee. He's out for the season. As we go forward, BJ Cunningham is someone that we've talked about on past podcasts and in our fantasy guide. He's going to be a guy to watch for because he's going to be right in there, ready to go. He's been around this offense for a year or two. With the suspension of Deron Carter, Kenny Stafford is also going to be the other big guy to look for. Nick Lewis has got a lot of targets through these first 2 games. And then coming off the practice roster, because they'll need to fill the roster spot, a couple guys to look for. It hasn't come out yet. Obviously, with the bye, the Alouettes aren't practicing this week. But a couple names to watch for are Chandler Jones and Corbin Lokes. A couple guys that did very well in the training camp and preseason, impressed Jim Pop. So keep an eye out as the week goes on and leading into the Alouettes game next week. Between those 2 guys, there might be a couple of sleepers there of one of them that steps up into the Alouettes offense as a receiver.
And a guy to put in your back pocket over the weeks to come. He was a guy who showcased his talent last year, but Alex Charette, he might have an opportunity to show up somewhere in the Montreal lineup.
Yeah. Once he's back from the 6-game injured list, he had a kind of a nagging injury there, and so they've put him on the 6th game. Once he's back off in that following that 6th game, he could be another guy, and as a Canadian, could be in competition with Sam Giguère in the receiver group. All
right, but week by week right now, guy to put in your back pocket. No need to think of him yet. So why don't we get down to what we're talking about off the top there. Sorry to call an audible on you, Mr. Dan, the stats guy. Tyrell Sutton, sprained MCL, added to the 6th game, which gives an opportunity for 1B to get a chance to go.
Brandon Rutley, who I believe was inactive in the first game, if I have that correct. In this last game, he dressed. And the thing is with Brandon Rutley, in our fantasy guide, we said that Brandon Rutley can do all the same things that Tyrell Sutton can out of the backfield, and in some cases even faster. He ran a faster 40 coming out of college. He put up more yards in college. So it's going to be interesting to see how he does over these next 6 games. I think Rutley is a guy that they can lean on also out of the passing game, out of the backfield. So I would be very confident in starting Brandon Rutley. Obviously, he may not have the same value on DraftKings from a dollar value, so there could be a real value play there as far as starting him. But watch for him once we get to week 4.
Trayvon Van from Ottawa, a bit of a spark plug there in the first couple of games and an unfortunate injury. It looked like he tried to tough it out coming back, but Keenan LaFrance got the bulk of carries after that. He's going to go down to the 6th game. Moses Madu, a bit of a name from the past, a former Hamilton Ticat, will find his way into the backfield.
Yeah, people were asking about Moses Madu. As we go on in the podcast here into the social media segment, it became kind of a fun thing to watch. The Red Blacks came out. They said that Madu, it looks like he's going to be the likely starter for them this weekend against the Calgary Stampeders. And people are trying to remember back what kind of a player Moses Madu was and what to expect from him. The biggest thing from him in his Hamilton Ticat is he was a real strong fantasy play in 2014. Not much from the rushing game. He only produced kind of 40, 50 yards a game at his top end level. As far as production goes, season high of 56 yards that season. But it was in the receiving game that he put up most of his fantasy points. He had 4 games with over 70 yards, 72, 88, 86, and 87 in those 4 games. Played 15 games over the course of the season, I believe. So he's a guy that's been around the CFL. He finished with 512 receiving yards that year, 348 rushing yards. He sort of fits that Ottawa Red Blacks, prototypical running back. They started out with Siobhan Walker a couple years ago, and they've moved into this typical player that can run the ball, but also is it very important that they can catch the ball out of the backfield. You saw that with Jeremiah Johnson. You saw that with William Powell. You saw that with Trayvon Van, and you're going to see that with Madu, someone that they're going to use as a receiver on checkdowns out of the backfield.
Jeremiah Johnson now finds himself in BC, and he found himself watching as Shaq Murray-Lawrence carried a bulk of the carries at the end of the game last week. An ankle injury, didn't practice on Monday. Anthony Allen signed in the offseason, hasn't seen any reps yet. He was practicing with the first-team offense on Monday. Jeremiah Johnson, no word yet if he's not going to play this week, but definitely keep an eye on him. And Anthony Allen he's a bit of a different skill set than Jeremiah Johnson. He's more of a downhill runner, but he still can be able to make defenders miss tackles. So Anthony Allen does have fantasy value. Where we rank him, you'll have to wait and see. You can check out our DFS rankings or subscribe to those as we release those this week. Brandon Whitaker, bit of a weird injury in the game against the Riders. However, he did make it back.
Yeah, it goes down with a neck injury. No word on if he's going to be missing any time this week from the Argos, but watch as it goes forward. In that game, Anthony Coombs actually came up and got a bit of playing time out of the backfield for the Argos. So if Coombs does, that obviously raises his value. The Argos are in an interesting one there. The one that would probably come off the practice roster if Whitaker's unable to go this weekend would be Chad Cackert, the veteran running back that they cut and then brought back to their practice roster. So keep an eye on that one, whether Brandon Whitaker is able to go this weekend.
New fans to the CFL, Chad Cackert, you're going to love this guy. People in fantasy football, the great thing about DFS is Chad Cackert, you can bring him onto your roster and never have to have him ever again, and it's fine. In long format football, some teams, some owners get frustrated with a Chad Cackert because of his ability to, not find the lineup that much. But anyway, so Chad Cackert could be an option as we move into receivers. Weston Dressler, Winnipeg Blue Bombers, big offseason signing, missed the most of the first game with a concussion, but looks like there's positive news for Bomber fans.
Yeah, he missed last week also with the concussion, and Thomas Mayo came into the lineup. So word is from Mike O'Shea as of Monday is that Dressler will be good to go for the Bombers game this weekend. So that's a big one for them. He obviously was a big target guy in week 1 against the Montreal Alouettes before going down with the injury. And this week they have a very tough matchup with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. They're going to need as many weapons as they can have in that receiving group. So if Dressler's good to go, he could be the big target for Drew Willie.
Very physical and aggressive defense in Hamilton as well. And you didn't see that last week, but you wonder how that's going to play into this week. And Lamar Durant, big, lots of high praise for this guy and lots of potential. A Canadian as well, if you're in a format that supports that of long format football. He looks like he didn't practice today. Simone Charbonneau-Campo came in a nice replacement role, caught a touchdown against the Bombers last week. Lamar Durant, hopefully with a sprained ankle, might be able to make it back in the lineup. And a big target, big body, good hands, made a nice catch against BC in where he got injured in the first week. So we hope for Lamar Durant's sake and for Stampeders fans and for DFS fans, fantasy football value, Lamar Durant, a big play receiver with a very low value. Jameel Smith, returner for Ottawa. He'll be out for a bit of a long term.
Yeah, 6 games with a broken rib. So he goes on the 6-game IR on Monday. And with the Red Blacks, they signed veteran returner Tristan Jackson, who's also doubles up as a cornerback onto their team this week. Chris Williams, obviously, last game picked up the bulk of the returns, so that brings his value up even further than it already was, and another big week out of him when we get to the top players of the week. But the Red Blacks obviously don't want Chris Williams doing double duty all season, so they're going to be looking for returners, and Tristan Jackson is one to look at. They also signed Nick Grigsby to the practice roster this week, so over these next 6 games, there's going to be some juggling in terms of who they return, and also Moses Madu may also, as a running back, also get into the return game, as the Red Blacks didn't shy away from that with Siobhan Walker and his time with the team. So plenty of options at the returner, but watch for the depth chart once it comes out in advance of their game against the Stampeders this weekend.
Quite often, people will jump on Nick Grigsby and in long format football and hopes that the payoff could be there. And he's got the talent, he's got the speed. We saw that in Winnipeg. However, he's found himself off and on a few rosters, so just definitely be a little more careful with that. And Nick Grigsby, friend of the show, does follow the account, so a bit of a shout out to him there too. All right, defensive lineman, moving on to there. Mikael Brooks, that's a big one that we had high hopes for this year in BC. Did not practice on Monday, an ankle injury. Brian Turner got a lot of the reps there, former Winnipeg Blue Bomber. Had a great year or two in Winnipeg and then found himself on the way out. Has new work in BC. Potentially, if Mikael Brooks isn't good to go, Brian Turner could be coming off the end, which might not be a bad fit for the Lions. And Micah Johnson is a big hole for the Calgary Stampeders if he doesn't get healthy for the weekend.
He was sick at that game on Friday, according to Calgary Sun writer Scott Mitchell, when the Stampeders took on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So he missed a lot of action on that game, or during that game on Friday, and remains sick as of Monday, didn't practice. The Stampeders recently signed Zach Minter, previous of the BC Lions, to their team. He could be inserted into the lineup if Johnson is still sick by the weekend. Another one also with the Stampeders along that defensive line, the second starter in the middle of the line there, Quinn Smith, the Canadian, didn't practice on Monday. He's got a shoulder injury. And in his place, look for Derek Wigan, another Canadian, to fill in that spot.
And the one defensive back, Bruce Johnson, didn't practice on Monday. Travis Hawkins, former Toronto Argonaut, released and signed a few days later in Bomberland. He could make an appearance if come time for game time at the trip out to Hamilton that he isn't back up to health. So quite an infirmary from the weekend's games there. A lot of guys going down and coming back up there. I know Abdul Kane had a bit of a bruised hip. Looked like he was okay after that for the Ottawa Red Blacks as well. But some big performers last week. And boy, oh boy, fantasy football-wise, happy to report I won in 2 of my leagues. And the other one, well, I just got edged out briefly. But a reason why I won one of them was right off the top, not disappointing at all, back-to-back weeks, Mr. Trevor Harris in Ottawa.
Yeah, back-to-back weeks, like you say, and Henry Burris down with the injury in week 1. Harris comes in, and he's a guy that is a high percentage passer, completes a high percentage of his passes. He's got a pile of targets there, and you saw that with Burris in 2015, so it's not a situation where it's a drop down to the number 2. Harris is going to keep this up and gets a decent matchup against the Calgary Stampeders in week 3 here going forward. So watch for Trevor Harris to just keep on keeping on.
32.3 points on the draft, the DFS rankings. Second, Mr. Garbage Time himself. We need to find a nickname for Mr. Bomber quarterback Drew Willie. Just under 30 fantasy points on DraftKings. And that must be so frustrating for people, especially fans in Winnipeg who, I don't know, what do you have to say for a guy like this? I know even Marshall Ferguson, a TSN anchor, had the same problem that we did watching this guy play.
Well, with the thing with Drew Willie, though, those points still count, though.
That's true.
Another player that also will be on this list as well from the Bombers, a couple of them actually, in terms of Andrew Harris and Darvin Adams, those points still count. And Drew Willie, you watch the whole game, it's frustrating. There's calls for Matt Nichols to come into the lineup from Bombers fans, and people have not been impressed with the performance of Drew Willie thus far this season from a strictly football perspective. But from a fantasy perspective, he's been a decent enough performer, but he's also coming with a hefty price tag week in and week out. But again, yeah, like you say, 29.22 points in week 2.
Bit of a surprise there, I would say. Mr. Willie, he's a hard guy to read. But Dan, the stats guy, on top of all that, when we're talking fantasy football, Bo Levi Mitchell, 25.36 points, rounds out the top 3 performers. And it looked like at one point he might have had 45 points, but the Bombers defense woke up, or the Stampeders decided to stop putting up points.
Well, you look at the one play where it could have been extra points on the deep bomb to Joe West, and West was stopped at the 2-yard line. Had that one gone, more points for Bo Levi Mitchell. Instead, Torrey Harrison punches it in for the touchdown. But Bo Levi Mitchell, We kind of harped on him after week one, said kind of a bit of a told you so, but we also said he could come back with a big week against a weak Bomber defense, and he did just that, putting up 25.36 DraftKings points.
We had him ranked very high last week. Andrew Harris, running back out of Winnipeg, 19 fantasy points, and most of those were gathered through the passing game, as he had over 100 points from scrimmage, 100 yards, from scrimmage, with those counting running and through the passing game. Jerome Messam put up some big yards there and might have been a touchdown or two more. We expected him to get a little more red zone time, but still able to put up some respectable numbers for the big guy out of Calgary.
Yeah, 137 yards on the ground. Just the one target through the air for Jerome Messam. And you compare that, like you said, with Andrew Harris. Harris getting 11 targets, 9 receptions through the air. So Messam, it was all on the ground, 16 carries, 137 yards, 16.7 points on DraftKings, just ahead of Curtis Steele, the Saskatchewan Roughriders, with 16.5. Another guy who did it both through the rushing game and through the receiving game, getting 10 catches and 5 receptions to put up those points.
Moving on to receivers. This guy only gets better and better every week, and man, is he fun to watch. The number one target in Ottawa, he's not disappointing for how he was hyped up coming into this season.
187 yards receiving and the touchdown again this week. 20 punt return yards and 29 field goal yards. That adds up to 37.15 points for Chris Williams. Again, a big money play on DraftKings, but he paid off again. We talked about it last week, the difference between him and between first and second, and in terms of the receivers, and Chris Williams 10 points up on the number 2 guy at receiver. So he was well worth the dollars he spent on him, and you're seeing it where it's not just on the offense, but also on special teams that he's contributing to you.
That number 2 guy, Marquay McDaniel, which if you listened to our show last week, we had a bit of a discussion about Mr. McDaniel. Yeah, he's a player who can put up points. 27.6 on DraftKings this week. He had himself a great game against the Bombers. Now, the question will be his repeat performance. If you look through his career, there has been a bit of a pattern after a big game for a bit of a drop-off. So if you're looking at valuing Marquay McDaniel, maybe take a look at that as we'll get on throughout the show and as we discuss that throughout the week. But 27.6 points last week, and yardage-wise, that's what Dan the Stats guy is here for.
116 yards through the air. He was actually targeted 12 times, one of the most targeted guys in the league with 7 receptions. So not a great catch percentage in terms of the passes sent his way, but the big touchdown doesn't hurt you in any way. And McDaniel's going to be a big number guy. We talked about that being the reason that we're kind of hesitant on him, that if you're going to be putting 7,000 plus on him on DraftKings, he better perform week in, week out. And you're going to see that where after a big performance, is he going to be worth the $7,000? I'd be hesitant.
Naaman Roosevelt, Saskatchewan, coming into this season, if you bought our 2016 fantasy guide, we had him kind of looked at as potentially one of the top receivers in Saskatchewan, and he had a lot of targets last week with 22.3 DraftKings points.
15 targets we said on Twitter on Monday. He caught 9 of those for 113 yards, puts up the 22.3 points, didn't get a touchdown in the game, and it would have catapulted him into second place there ahead of McDaniel. But Roosevelt, yeah, Darian Durant has a chemistry with him. They've been working all winter. Obviously, he feels a comfort level with him at that weak side receiver spot. Look for more and more targets for Naaman Roosevelt going forward.
And this next one, I would have to say, is Kevin Glenn factor, definitely contributing to this. And a guy who's been a long-time CFL vet, still can get it done, 20.4 DraftKings points, Mr. Nick Lewis in Montreal.
And the thing with Nick Lewis that I think you have to keep in mind here is that now that the Alouettes are down Duron Carter for the one game and down SJ Green for the remainder of the season, Lewis's role isn't going to change in the Alouettes offense. He's not suddenly going to become a guy that goes on deep routes or kind of the types of plays that Carter and Green ran. He's going to stay that same sort of player, catching short passes, 3 or 4 yard outs, and just watching him bowl over guys for first downs. That's what happened here. He was targeted 12 times, 9 catches, 114 yards. And those are going to be the types of performances he puts up. Kevin Glenn feels comfortable with him, and that's the type of play that Kevin Glenn does succeed in. And the only time that Kevin Glenn, it seems to be when he struggles, is when he tries to go for those over-the-top passes and creates a turnover. So look for him to continue with Nick Lewis. They're going to try and get those high percentage plays, especially without Duron Carter and SJ Green out of the lineup. But that's for next week. But Nick Lewis puts up over 20 points on just those short passes.
Darvin Adams continues to week in and week out put up some decent numbers for the Bombers. Developed chemistry with Drew Willie last year, 19.2 points last weekend, rounding out the top 5 of the top players this week. And Darvin Adams likely will continue to do that.
Well, he may or may not actually. I was going to say he may not actually continue that, because in the absence of Weston Dressler, he shifts over to that short side receiver spot on the boundary, and he takes those targets that Weston Dressler normally would get. Otherwise, he'll be lining up on the slot and competing for targets with Ryan Smith and Dressler. And to me, it just seems like Weston Dressler coming back in the lineup sort of makes me want to take a little bit of pause on Darvin Adams, because with a lot of quarterbacks, it really depends on where they're looking to. And in the case of Adams, back-to-back games with touchdowns. And if you're dependent on a player to get touchdowns every single week, you might end up with a game where he gets okay yards but doesn't get that touchdown and doesn't get you the payout that you want.
All right, so Darvin Adams, maybe if you're interested in finding out some more info on that, take a look at our DraftKings rankings. When those come out, our DFS rankings each and every week. Darvin Adams, keep an eye on him. He has the ability to explode, but the problem in Winnipeg will be in coming weeks. Do they have enough footballs? That likely is going to be the biggest problem. The BC Lions, they collect footballs on defense. They steal them from quarterbacks, and they got 24 points last weekend, destroying the Hamilton Ticats in a place they don't lose very often.
Yeah, and it's a really tough group to play against. That was on the road. They're back at home this week against the Toronto Argonauts, and you're just seeing the strengths of that BC team come through in their linebacking group. You look at their secondary, you got guys like TJ Lee, Ronnie Yell, Ryan Phillips. Phillips obviously comes up with the interception this past week, and Craig Rowe with a big sack on the Ticats during the game. They actually picked up 4 as a team on the week. And then also the big point producer for them, limiting the Hamilton Tiger Cats to single digits.
As advertised in the offseason, didn't get enough respect from a number of outlets. The BC Lions are a tough team to read, but if you watch them towards the end of last year, boy, did you have a feeling that we have something special brewing this season. And when we get to looking at the preview for this upcoming week, potentially much more of that to be expected. Value players from the week. One guy that I got to say, doesn't matter what team you cheer for in the CFL, it was great to see number 4 back and slinging the ball in Saskatchewan, and DraftKings players were rewarded with that on the point side.
Over 300 yards passing for Darian Durant in his season debut with the Rough Riders in Chris Jones and Stephen McAdoo's offense. He had a $9,000 value, and he was right around that level, but when you compare him to guys like Ricky Ray, who was 9,300, Bo Levi Mitchell is 9,500, and then obviously Drew Willie at 9,600. His $9,000 value and putting up 22 points freed up some extra dollars for you at other positions, and Durant had a nice performance, like you said, and as he gets more and more comfortable, it seemed like he was hobbled a little bit in that game. If that continues on, it might be a question mark, but if Durant can get healthy and get that ground game going and get some rushing yards as well, you might be seeing him as a big value player.
He's in some tough contests this week, we'll tell you that much. We won't get there yet. Shaquille Murray-Lawrence, he had 8.9 DraftKings points, and boy, probably looking at this list, the lowest valued player. And if you had him somehow, you were able to cash in.
Yeah, just above that $2,500 floor. Shaq Murray-Lawrence at $2,700. He obviously, the big one is getting the touchdown on the ground, but 13 carries, 39 yards, and the touchdown. He did have a fumble during the game that I guess took his stats down by 1, but the injury to Jeremiah Johnson opened the door, and we've already talked about it, that he won't be the starter going forward. It looks like it would be Anthony Allen if Johnson isn't able to go, but in-game, if there are injuries, we've talked about Keenan LaFrance on past podcasts, where an injury to the starting running back opens the door for Canadian running back. I see similar type value between Murray Lawrence and Keenan LaFrance going forward, where if there is an opportunity, they may jump in, but don't hold your breath for them to be the starter week after week.
LaFrance put up similar numbers, 8.4 points, $3,300 DraftKings value for the Ottawa Redblacks, obviously with Trayvon Van going down, and he'll find his way in the lineup, but he'll have some competition now with the signings of Moses Madu and Nick Grigsby. But because of that passport, and he's a meat and potatoes kind of running back. He's not flashy, but he got a lot of looks last week, so there is a little bit of value on him going forward. And a guy that I would say one of the most underrated players in the entire CFL, the second fiddle running back, I would have to argue 1A, 1B in Calgary with $4,600 last week and put up some decent points.
Yeah, puts up 12 points, and the big one, obviously, again with that is gets the touchdown to put him up over that 10-point value at 12 points. 5 carries, 40 yards on the ground. One catch for 10 yards. He's going to be a guy that the Stampeders use more as a receiver than Jerome Messam. I think they see Messam as the bowling ball out of the backfield, and Harrison a little bit more of a shifty guy that they can use. So watch, especially in the red zone. I found that to be an interesting one, and I know a lot of other people did, that they handed off the ball to Harrison inside the 10 instead of Messam, so he could have some extra value as a red zone guy.
One guy that a lot of people out there had a little bit of high promise for, and many are touting for it to be a fantastic year for Sean Gore in BC, but going forward, you wonder when this might peter off. But if you did get a hold of him last week, he did not disappoint in the stats category.
Well, one play in particular was the one that paid off for his owners, a 60-yard catch off of a failed coverage by the now released Jeff Tisdale of the Hamilton Ticats. Gore puts up 18.6 points and 116 yards through the air on 4 catches, just 4 catches on 5 targets. And we had said that last week that, you know, it maybe looked to a little bit like we weren't know who we were talking about, but only 5 targets for Sean Gore. He gets those 116 yards. You take away that 60-yard play, and suddenly he's sort of right in that value that we had talked about as a 50-something yard receiver, not a 100-something yard receiver. And you'd go game by game, $3,800 value. It paid off for those that got him again for a second week in a row. But again, we caution a little bit with Sean Gore.
Jace Davis finding himself in the lineup for Winnipeg due to injury, obviously, and looking pretty good. 15.9 points, $3,600 value, obviously in replacement of Weston Dressler.
A replacement for Weston Dressler, but he's not going to be completely out of the lineup once Dressler returns from this concussion. A player that we'll also touch on here, Thomas Mayo, had a $3,400 value, put up 12.8 points himself. Mayo looks to go back to the practice roster with Dressler coming back to the lineup, and Davis will continue to start in that 5th role. It'll be interesting to see what kind of dollar value he has, but don't expect, again, a double-digit performance from Jace Davis if Dressler, Adams, and Smith are good to go this week.
And we mentioned Nick Lewis, one of the top performers and also a top value player for this week at $4,500. And going forward, he'll continually be a guy that Kevin Glenn leans on. Joe West, as we had mentioned, expected big things out of him last week, and he did not disappoint at $4,000.
Yeah, Joe West puts up 8 catches, 91 yards on 10 targets, and we had said that in our rankings. We can kind of pat ourselves on the back a little bit. We had Joe West inside the top 10, and he had a very good matchup in that Winnipeg game as they continue to go with younger players, but he also saw some time opposite Chris Randall, and we just felt like it was just the right matchup for him based on the way that Randall defends. They've been teammates in the past, and West rewarded those that started him with 17.1 points.
And in the condiment battle, my favorite battle of the weekend, Thomas Mayo versus Duron Mayo. Thomas Mayo came out victorious at 12.8 points for $3,400.
Yeah, if you took the risk on starting Thomas Mayo, you did get those 12 points. But like I said, looks like he's going to be back onto the practice roster for week number 3 here.
Spread it on. The Toronto Argonauts defense. I couldn't resist the pun. 12 points, $4,600 against Riders offense that we maybe expected a little more out of, but their defense still some respectable numbers there.
Well, the big one there is the 2 fumble recoveries and the defensive touchdown that brought up the Argonauts numbers for the 12 points. That was one. You looked at the defensive touchdown off of the fumble recovery from the Bryant Moni's short yardage fumble. You're not going to get those week in and week out, so it's not like the Argos, I guess, that you overvalue them too much. They're obviously going to be facing a tough BC Lions team this week. So, again, temper your expectations.
Yeah, I was going to say, spoiler alert, they're not going to be putting that up this week. That's guaranteed. Biggest disappointment players of the week. One of them that almost got booed off the field, I believe, a gunslinger in Hamilton. And I'm just telling you right now, if you bought our fantasy guide, it's written right there. So if you hear it anywhere else that Jeremiah Mazzoli is going to be this fantastic fantasy football player, he'd tread with caution around this guy, and he didn't put up some very good numbers on the weekend.
Yeah, and it was a tough day as far as the weather went for quarterbacks to throw the ball in that game. Both he and Jonathan Jennings struggled a little bit, but in the case of Masoli, 248 yards, 2 interceptions. He only had 1 carry on the ground for 1 yard and puts up a disappointing 8.02 points. After a big week in week 1 with 28.72 points, he falls back to earth. Favorable matchup this week with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So I think more than anything, and maybe we can get to this in the matchups or we can discuss it now, but the thing I'm kind of seeing with Mazzoli in that game is maybe Kent Austin has a little bit of a leash on him and has Jeff Matthews in his pocket ready to go. Zach Collaros was starting to fire the ball a little bit in practice. It's going to be interesting this week in terms of the Ticats meetings, in terms of what they're how they're working with Masoli. But that game just didn't seem like he had a whole lot of confidence in his own play.
We do know Austin and Mr. Matthews do have that Cornell University connection. So it'll be interesting to see how short of a leash that is on Mazzoli. On the running back category, one guy that we'd like to see get going, and straight out of the CFL draft, there was high potential for him, but only 3.7 points. Anthony Coombs was another one that if you started, you weren't very happy with.
Yeah, for the second week in a row. And the thing is with him, we talked about it last week, he's going to see time as a running back, a receiver, in the return game, and kind of all over the field, where you were hoping, a lot of people are very, very high on guys like Chris Rainey and Brandon Banks, and you hope that Anthony Coombs can have a breakout performance, but until he does, I'm going to have him sort of down on his projection level in terms of dollar value on DraftKings. He had a $4,800 value, up from his $4,500 value in week 1. He shows up on this list for the second week in a row. So again, with Coombs, play the wait and see game until he has a big game. Don't be putting your high expectations on him.
One guy who frequents this list, Stefan Logan in Montreal, where he just doesn't get the reps he used to when he was a BC Lion. $4,800, 3.75 points, not a whole lot of targets, but now with Tyrell Sutton injured, obviously as Montreal is on the bye week, we've alluded to several times, that may change a little bit, but don't hit your wagon on that thinking that Stefan Logan is going to get all these targets suddenly. But a disappointment player last week, but that could potentially change in weeks to come.
Well, and the thing is with him, I think a lot of our American listeners will recognize Stefan Logan's name as a returner from the NFL, most notably with the Detroit Lions. He was a big returner at the NFL level. He's back, and that's more with the role he plays than anything. And like Dave said, in years past, he was used more in the offense. And with him, you look at him and you expect him to have 1 or 2 returns a year that he takes to the house. But it just seemed like this past week, he just didn't have it again. And it'll be interesting to watch. He is an older guy. I believe he's already into sort of his mid-30s. And, guys start to slow down a little bit. But, keep an eye on Stefan Logan. But don't, with that big dollar value of $4,800, don't expect him to be in the top 5 amongst the running backs.
35 years old is Stefan Logan. So yeah, June 2nd birthday, just turned 35. So I wouldn't expect that to change anytime soon. But potentially, you never know how that's going to happen with Brandon Redley in the offense. So needless to say, keep listening to our podcast. We'll keep you in the loop. Torrey Gurley, a guy that caught a lot of touchdowns last season, had some high, still has great potential this year, but a bit disappointing performance last week for $7,500 for only 4.2 points.
For how well that Argonauts team showed up on the scoreboard, it just didn't seem like their offense for the second week in a row was in kind of in check with each other and then in rhythm. In the case of Tori Gurley, we talked about it on the podcast last week. This isn't just a dollar value disappointment. This is our own disappointment because we were both high on Tori Gurley with that matchup with the Riders having a rookie free safety to cover him and Vidal Hazelton on the deep patterns. Hazelton obviously gets the big one, gets the touchdown, and leads the Argos to victory. But in the case of Gurley, only 3 targets, 1 catch for 32 yards, a big disappointment, particularly with that $7,500 value.
Brandon Banks, no kick return touchdown yet. $6,200, 3.7 points. A bit of a disappointment on the weekend, too. And the American viewers, you get a chance to see Brandon Banks bring one back to the house. It's something special. That guy's got some speed. But if you had him on your lineup and you had him in the special teams as well, didn't get the payoff you were looking for.
Well, and one of the things, and there's 2 parts to this I kind of want to say, is that with that, again, you go back to the weather in Hamilton, and during that game, not the best conditions for a returner because the wind was kind of swirling. You weren't going to get a clean look at the ball and being able to set up a return for a punt or for a kick. So that, isn't a huge surprise. The other thing, someone asked me, is the weather like that always in Hamilton? I wouldn't say that. Myself, I would say more so it's a little bit more unpredictable in Saskatchewan and Winnipeg out on the prairies. But in terms of Hamilton, that's not a typical thing as far as bad weather and bad wind like that, would you say, Dave?
There was a game, I believe it was a couple years back, and maybe it was before Hamilton opened up Tim Hortons Field, but they were playing a neutral site game somewhere in southern Ontario that was fairly close to Hamilton.
That would have been Guelph.
So I do remember that in that game, and in southern Ontario, they are pretty known for their inclement weather around that area. So swirling winds can come in fairly often, but it's usually the inclement weather of the rain and the sun and the rain and the sun that does happen there. So I guess when it comes to weather, it's unpredictable. But one thing that's certain, Brandon Banks usually has a great game, and you'll likely see him turn it up at some point in time this season. And if you're looking at a disappointment, Nick Moore can be on that list with only 7.4 points and $6,800. But I wish there was an asterisk in a category for highlight reel catch. And there's a way you can add like 10 points under the value because he had one of the nicest catches that you're going to see this year in the CFL. But still, when it comes to point value, only 7.4 points.
And we'll talk about this in the matchups. So those Hamilton halfbacks to the BC slot packs, we're giving up nothing. Emmanuel Arsenault, only 6 catches. Nick Moore himself with 3 catches, and then Brian Burnham with 2 catches. Those are guys that you expect higher value out, but that Hamilton Ticats defense is a very, very tough group to get anything against, and a lot of incompletions by Jonathan Jennings in that game. And obviously, like we said, go back to the wind and the weather for that game. But as far as Nick Moore goes, back to home to BC, to a little bit more of a climate-controlled environment. If it is a nice day, they'll have the roof open. If it's not, they've got the dome. So expect Nick Moore at least a little bit to bounce back from just 3 catches.
In the disappointment category, Kamar Jordan, $6,100, only 6.4 points, and this might be a sign, potentially, as we'll get to that in a little bit, of things to come, possibly for the Calgary Stampeders. But after catching a touchdown in week 1, not as many targets we would have anticipated in that game against the Bombers.
Well, and with that one, he was paired up a lot with Bruce Johnson, the Bombers' big defensive back, who's obviously someone we talked about that might not be available this week against Hamilton. Jordan, it just seemed, he wasn't getting much underneath, and they went a lot more to Joe West, the guy right next door to him, and obviously Marquay McDaniel had the most targets of any Stampeders receiver. I think what you're going to see, Dave Dickinson's a fairly creative guy. He's the head coach and offensive coordinator for the Stampeders. He's going to be working each receiver in, and it's going to be a different guy every week from that group.
And rounding out the biggest disappointments of the week, the Saskatchewan Roughriders defense. No, this isn't a 2015 fantasy football podcast. This is week number 2 recap of the CFL. And Yeah, they didn't put up the kind of numbers that we'd expected them to at $4,900, but that could change in weeks to come.
Yeah, well, we had talked about it actually in our fantasy guide about the Rough Riders in their defensive group. There's a whole lot of turnover there, but you look at Chris Jones, he's worked with defenses across the CFL for about 15 years here, and I think what we had kind of said was that this Rough Riders group, it may take them 2, 3, a handful of games before they get a comfort level with each other, and then that's when they start putting up points as a defense. Early on in the season, I'd steer clear of them a little bit, but once they have a breakout game, this could be a very, very dominant group.
Probably won't be this week. We'll get to that in the next segment. All right, top waiver wire ads. We've talked about a number of these players already, so let's just fire through the stats and we can highlight a couple that we haven't really touched on. Running back, not this week, but going forward, Brandon Rutley, Montreal, 3 carries, 11 yards, 2 catches, 10 yards last week with Tyrell Sutton, obviously in the 6th game. He's got explosive potential. Anthony Allen hasn't dressed yet. In Saskatchewan last year, did some great things, potentially can do that going forward too. Moses Madu in Ottawa, he'll be the starting guy this weekend. Keenan LaFrance, 13 carries, 52 yards, 1 catch for 22. In case Madu's not ready, potentially, there are a lot of Keenan LaFrance owners that's growing out there. And as we mentioned, Torrey Harrison, underrated player of the year category for the Stamps, 5 carries, 40 yards, and a touchdown. Gets a lot of those red zone TDs, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me when you got a guy who's 9 feet tall and 300 pounds. But hey, that's fine. I'm the guy on the podcast, and they're running the offense. And he's getting points, right? He's getting points. All right, on to wide receivers. Jace Davis, talked about that already. 5 catches, 49 yards, and a TD last week. Thomas Mayo, 5 catches for 78. Likely not going to see any action now that Dressler is back this week. But a guy Dan and I have been very excited about the minute we saw him in preseason, Ricky Collins in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, he showed some good stuff again in that last weekend here against the Toronto Argonauts. One catch in particular, I remember, where he fought to keep his foot in bounds after making the catch. He's going to be a guy that I think Darian Durant is going to go to. He's a big target for him, and someone that I think if you're looking for in deep leagues, that you're looking for maybe a bye week ad or something along those lines, target Ricky Collins as a receiver.
BJ Cunningham, another guy you should be looking at on the waiver wire. Didn't get, he had 1 target the game against Winnipeg and dropped it on about the 5-yard line after he bobbled it a little bit. But towards the end of the year last year, in our fantasy guide, we see big things from BJ Cunningham.
Yeah, to replace SJ Green full-time in the lineup, and then obviously the DeGron Carter suspension. Get him now while you can, because once the time the Alouettes come back next week, he's probably already going to be taken off your waiver wire.
Chandler Jones and Corbin Lokes in Montreal with the S.J. Green injury, as Dan alluded to earlier. Another couple of guys you can look at. And in the defensive line category, Frank Beltre, one that we were probably texting back and forth with this guy, saying he's probably one of our top waiver wire ads. Get him now, 3 tackles. Charleston Hughes did have a sack, but it was the last play of the game. It looks like Frank Beltre may be the guy going forward for Calgary, and he's going to be good.
Yeah, he was constantly in the backfield. There was talk about the Stampeders maybe taking a look at Sean Lemon, and if you are maybe also looking for an ad, we don't have him on our list, but maybe Sean Lemon. But getting back to the Stampeders, there was talk that maybe they would look at Lemon. They didn't. They didn't make a trade with the Rough Riders. Frank Beltre will continue to be the starter going forward there, and he is a very active defensive end for them.
AC Leonard, former tight end receiver, now converted to defensive line at a couple of sacks and 3 tackles last week. Jonathan Newsom, a couple of tackles there himself, but he was the starter listed on the rush end side. AC Leonard on the interior. But both of those guys could have some promise going forward before Eric Norwood's back.
Yeah, Eric Norwood, who starts the year on the 6-game injured list. Obviously, once he's back, he's going to be the guy that you're going to want to go with. But in the meantime, if you need some production from your defensive lineman in long format, look to AC Leonard and Jonathan Newsom in that battle in Saskatchewan.
Craig Rowe, BC, 2 tackles and a sack, listed in our fantasy guide. A lot of turnover on that BC Lions defense and the front 4 especially. A lot of guys looking for, not turnover, a lot of guys looking for a new kind of revitalization for this season, and Craig Rowe is one that could potentially see some of that.
That's a very good BC Lions defense, and you've got at the opposite Alex Bazzi, who's a big sack number guy. But Craig Rowe, don't sleep on him. He's coming from the opposite end, and I've said it on past podcasts. If you're looking to add defensive linemen, stay clear of defensive tackles. I know they get a lot. They're great big guys. They're fun to look at. I remember Andre Monroe last year. Everyone was so excited to see his sack dance. But if you're looking for defensive linemen, go for the safer option and go for a defensive end. And Craig Rowe is an underrated guy that's the starter in BC.
Linebacking side, if he's still available in a long format league, and he potentially could be, Larry Dean in Hamilton. Alex Hoffman-Ellis, no longer around. He had 8 tackles last week for the Ticats.
Yeah, Alex Hoffman-Ellis is now traded to Edmonton, and there may be value for him with the Eskimos. Maybe he will push Dion Lacey and J.C. Sherritt for playing time. But if you're looking for a safe option, look at Larry Dean in Hamilton with his 8 tackles this past week.
Bear Woods, 8 tackles also in a sack. Love the notes here. If he's available in your league, I'm on the floor laughing. Grab him now, which is true. If Bear Woods is on your wire in your long format league, you need to grab him.
Yeah, Bear Woods is a guy. The big thing with him, nobody had any stats on him last year as he missed the entire season. So he's back to the level he was 2 years ago, a big tackle guy and a guy that could be a disruptive player.
David Hines in Ottawa, 7 tackles. He's on the weak side linebacking position for the Red Blacks. And in a spot that the Red Blacks have a pretty active linebacking core, he could bring some fantasy value for you.
You talk about underrated players. David Hines is one of those players. He kind of was an afterthought coming into training camp as the Red Blacks already had Damaso Munoz in the middle and Malik Jackson, a veteran in the league. Hines wins the weak side linebacking starting job, and he's a guy that has already this season put up a lot of tackles.
All right, some guys to keep an eye on for defensive backs on the waiver wire too. Stats-wise, Buddy Jackson, Saskatchewan, had 4 tackles last week. Jonathan Mincy, Montreal, 6 tackles. He gets looked at quite a bit. Jonathan Rose in Ottawa, 6 tackles as well. Luscious Lucius Purifoy could be my new favorite name in the CFL. 5 tackles and a pick. He's playing in front of Stephen Clark, and that alone at Sime linebacker tells you he's got some game.
Yeah, he was a big play guy coming out of Florida State, I believe, out of college, and didn't pan out in the NFL, but he's going to be a big name in the CFL going forward.
And a Fog Ducker, Kevin Fogg, Winnipeg, 7 tackles. Definitely don't miss the boat on him. He might not be able to do the greatest on the coverage side, but hey, who cares about that? This is fantasy football. If you're looking at tackle numbers, Kevin Fogg is a guy that you can look at too. Looking at matchups this weekend. This is the exciting stuff, and got a lot to get through here. So yeah, crack open another beer. You know, keep going on your run or your drive or wherever you're. We're going to take care of business here. Looking at Thursday, back to back, Thursday, Friday, double headers. Let's fire through some of this. Weston Dressler could find his way back in the lineup, and he could be matched up against Dominic Ellis potentially. Maybe Rico Murray could be back there. Courtney Stephen, whoever that may be. But Weston Dressler, will he find some success in Hamilton on Thursday night?
Well, the Ticats released Jeff Tisdale after the weekend, so they're going to look for a replacement at the boundary corner. Dressler in that week 1, it seemed like in the first quarter before he went down with the concussion, every play went to him, and I think Drew Willie has that confidence that Dressler can get him the points and get him the yards. So watch for Dressler, regardless who he's up against. The Ticats will have someone new in there, and I'd be very confident with him because, as I talked about earlier, that group of Emmanuel Davis, Johnny Sears, Rico Murray, whoever's in their halfback and strong side linebacking group covering the slot packs are going to take them down. Only 111 yards combined last week for the 3 BC slot packs. And Emmanuel Arsenault, 6 catches on 12 targets. What does that tell you, Dave?
Emmanuel Arsenault, he's a big play guy. So that's a shutdown group right there. That's what that says. Andrew Harris against the Ticats defensive group in week 1 gave up 1 net rushing yard in the Argos. Week 2 gave up 127 yards on the ground to BC. So Andrew Harris, what do you expect out of that guy? He can still get it done.
Yeah, well, and that's a tough one to predict. We talked about it between ourselves on Monday afternoon, how to predict that Ticats defensive group, because week 1, 1 yard to the 1 yard net yard rushing to the Argos. Week 2, they give up 127 on the ground to BC. I think Andrew Harris is going to be a big touch the ball a lot for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in week 3 here. So I think, don't look at that week 1 as the expectation. Expect him to fall somewhere in between. And I think between those 2 games, that's the way to kind of value him.
All right, Chad Owens matched up against Julian Posey. Could potentially see some success there. Or Macho Harris might factor in and aiding in some of the coverage on that too.
Yeah, Chad Owens on those deep routes, you could see him go over the top and challenge Macho Harris, the free safety in Winnipeg. He could be a big one there. And you go through those slot backs, great slot backs from the Hamilton Tiger Cats with Chad Owens, Luke Tasker, and Andy Fantus. Bruce Johnson, who we talked about earlier, is a little bit banged up, but Markway McDaniel proved it last week that there can be some big yards against the Bombers defense from a slot back. And I think Luke Tasker could be the guy that really steps up this week, similar to McDaniel last week. And Andy Fantus is obviously going to see a lot of Mo Leggett from the strong side linebacker position. So Fantus might be a lot of targets, but maybe not some big yards downfield.
Taekwon Underwood is a guy that is going to be matched up against Chris Randall, and a guy that I know there's some overvaluing of him out there, and he's got talent. He does. He just has a bit of intensity to drop the ball. So no pun intended, literally. So if you have Taekwon Underwood, you're looking at bringing him either in long format or on DFS. I'd be a little hesitant on him, especially matched up against Chris Randall, who, when he was paired up against Joe West, Joe West had some success, but Chris Randall, he proved in week 1, he was pretty much the only reason why the Bombers were even in that game defensively.
Yeah, and that'll continue this week. As the Ticats are at home, you're going to see them try to get the big play, but I don't think Chris Randall is going to give a whole lot deep to Taekwon Underwood.
CJ Gable's a guy in the past that we've picked on, hasn't been able to put up a lot of yards. Here's an opportunity right here. The Bombers gave up 114 on the ground last week, and CJ Gable, we'd like to see him get some touches and do something with it if he can.
Yeah, well, 114 yards in week 1 against Montreal, 207 on the ground against the Calgary Stampeders last week. You obviously saw Jerome Messam put up a bunch of those. Gable hasn't proved a whole lot so far this season, but if he is given the chance, hopefully this is the week. And I think if you're looking for someone to maybe put an asterisk next to his name as a potential starter, CJ Gable could be your guy.
Looking at the late game there, we'll move to Vidal Hazelton versus Ronnie Yell. Vidal Hazelton known for putting up some big yards.
But Ronnie Yell has been a big performer. He's been shutting guys down all season long. It's going to be a tough matchup for the Toronto Argonauts, starting with, again, for the second straight week, a 10 o'clock Eastern kickoff. And also, they've been on the road already. They played in Saskatchewan last week. They've continued this road trip going further west to BC and taking on the BC Lions. So it's been a long couple of weeks for them, culminating with this Thursday night matchup. It's going to be a tough one for them, especially with their offense not looking very good last week. So Vidal Hazelton, I just have a tough time trusting him. Torrey Gurley gets Brandon Stewart on the field side. Stewart's a good cover guy deep, but I think that what you're going to see from Gurley is maybe some more targets over last week.
Kenny Shaw and Wallace Miles get TJ Lee or Ryan Phillips. Need no advertisement for what that's going to do. That'll bring some trouble. Brandon Whitaker is going to get Solomon Elamimi and Adam Bighill. Do you see a pattern here? Emmanuel Arsenault, however, versus Josh Mitchell or Isaiah Green could have a bit of a good day if the Argos get a lot of 2-and-outs.
Yeah, Arsenault, not a very good week last week. I think this week against a rookie, you saw it last week with Naaman Roosevelt and John Childs having decent enough days. I think against the tired Toronto group, Arsenault could have a big day.
Nick Moore gets Keon Raymond, so he might be in some trouble there. Brian Burnham could be matched up there too, but again, if the Argos get tired and defense has been on the field, may see some success late in the game. Sean Gore versus Akwasi Owusu-Ansah. This is one that I'll stop on. This could be a potentially, you look at Sean Gore and the success he's had, is that going to come to an end?
Yeah, I think you saw the lower targets this week from Sean Gore this past week, and Owusu-Ansah is the Argos' big cover guy. He was a little bit banged up against the Rough Riders, but I just have a tough time trusting Sean Gore this week against the premier defensive back in Owusu-Ansah.
And Jeremiah Johnson or Anthony Allen, whoever is carrying the ball in BC, you're going to want to load up on them, and we'll tell you about that when we release our DFS rankings very, very shortly in the coming days. Moving on to Friday, matching up Calgary and Ottawa, the early game. Chris Williams is going to be taking on Fred Bennett or Josh Bell. So potentially, he saw some big numbers in recent weeks playing against some rookies. However, that may change this week.
Well, Fred Bennett's a veteran guy, and obviously Josh Bell is one of the most athletic safeties in the CFL. You're going to see those guys really key on Chris Williams. I think this might be the week. Obviously, he's got those kickoff return yards that he could add, also in the punt return. But as far as from on the offense, I just have a tough time believing that Chris Williams will go on for his third straight week as the top receiver.
Ernest Jackson gets Jamar Wall, Greg Ellingson on Brandon Smith, and Sinopoli on Joe Burnett. All great shutdown defenders, so I wouldn't expect massive weeks from any of them.
Yeah, the Stampeders defense, although you saw that late in the game against the Bombers, some garbage time points put on the board, and also in that week one from the BC Lions. The Stampeders defense, we've talked about it, there is a possibility that they could start breaking down in this season, and if there's no pass rush due to those injuries along their defensive line, Trevor Harris can continue to sling the ball out. So watch one of those slotbacks from Ottawa to step up, but it's tough to predict which one because those are all veteran guys on the Stampeders defense.
Jerome Messam and Torrey Harrison on the running back side, they go up against that tough Red Blacks defense. They haven't given up more than 40 rushing yards yet this season, so don't expect a big one from either one in that game against the Red Blacks. Marquay McDaniel gets Abdul Kanay or Jarrell Gavins or even Antoine Pernot. And like we said, big week for Marquay. In the past, repeat performance, likely, very not likely the following week.
Yeah, he's the type of guy, it always seems he struggles a little bit with a little bit more of physical defensive backs. And you're seeing that with Abdul Kanay and also when Pernot gets in coverage. Those are very physical players in coverage, and it's going to be tough for them to a tough matchup, obviously, with McDaniel having the big day, but I think they'll key on him and try to eliminate him from the Stampeders offense.
Joe West matched up against Jonathan Rose. We see some success out of him. Kamar Jordan matched up against the Abdul Kanay or Gavins, and that could be potentially a struggling point for Mr. Kamar Jordan. Keep an eye on him. And Lamar Durant as well, if he's healthy. All guys that we've seen put up numbers in weeks past, but again, this is the Red Blacks defense, I think, is the theme there.
Yeah, the Red Blacks in week one obviously had the shootout with Edmonton Eskimos, a lot of yards through the air. I think it might play out in a similar way, but it does come down to the matchups. And last week, Kanay, very physical, Gavin's very physical. You're going to see a very physical game between these two teams when the Red Blacks are on defense, especially the fact that it's in the nation's capital.
Let's get physical. Moses Madu against the Stamps defensive group. If he's able to get in the lineup and put up some yards, likely won't be an abundance of them. So we had already talked about him at length earlier in the podcast. Anyway, and the late game on Friday, 10 o'clock Eastern, Saskatchewan and Edmonton, Eamon Roosevelt against Pat Watkins. Those big Pat Watkins fans, well, we likely see Roosevelt could have a little bit of success.
Yeah, Watkins is a big guy as a defensive back, but I think with Roosevelt, they may try to take him deep, and also they may also try to do what the Ottawa Red Blacks did in week one and try to move him around a little bit. You could see that from Chris Jones and Stephen McAdoo, try to get Roosevelt into a little bit more of a mismatch. John Childs gets Marcel Young. Ernest Jackson did get targets and success in week one, but had the lowest numbers of the Red Blacks receivers. So I'm not very high on Childs this week after he, in his Saskatchewan debut last week, got the touchdown.
Rob Begg would get Kenny Ladler and a little bit of Cord Parks too, so likely not going to see some big numbers out of him. Ricky Collins will be matched up against Parks or Ladler. So, but you never know with Ricky Collins. But I guess the big theme here, if you've never watched an Saskatchewan game heading into Edmonton, the Riders never have success in Edmonton offensively. Be a little bit more careful with how you load up on Saskatchewan players.
Yeah, and one player also that could factor in is Kendall Lawrence. And in that week two season debut for the Rough Riders, Curtis Steele was, as we had talked about earlier, someone that they used both as a running back, rushing the ball and receiving out of the backfield. I could see the Rough Riders kind of cycling in Lawrence a little bit, try to get him into matchups against his former teammates and give him lots of success. So he could be a fun name to watch, especially when you count in his return numbers as well.
Curtis Steele, he'll be in tough against a difficult defense. Darius Bowman will be matched up against Buddy Jackson. They're likely going to put a lot of coverage on Darius and Darrell Walker, which is why we think Nate Kuhorn could be in a good position to see some balls this weekend.
Yeah, you saw that last week with Vidal Hazelton as sort of the big play receiver for the Toronto Argonauts on one play in particular. But I think Nate Kuhorn, a lot of those in those shorter patterns, maybe in the red zone, you could see him maybe get a touchdown. Not the best matchup for Chris Getzlaff as a halfback or as a slot back. He's going to face a couple of tough halfbacks. It's going to be interesting to see. One name to watch for from the Rough Riders, whether or not he's in the lineup that could shore up their defense a little bit more, is Ed Gainey, a free agent signing from Hamilton in the off season. If he's in, it could be a little bit more of a tougher night for the Edmonton Eskimos offense. And lastly, for the Eskimos, John White looked great in week 1, but the Rough Riders were tough on Brandon Whitaker in week 2. There may not be a ton of yards from him as well.
All right, let's move into social media quickly. That's an action-packed, lot of information show. We're going to try and set a record here for the longest show in Onside CFL fantasy football history, but it's great. A lot of information. We're going to pack you with what you need. So let's fire through some social media here quickly. I guess the important thing, we teased it earlier, Brandon Rutley feels that he has value coming out of the backfield. Him and Herb Zurkowski, one of the newspaper writers in Edmonton, had a bit of an exchange there. So Rutley felt that he doesn't want to be forgotten about. And one that we had been talking about on Twitter with one of the listeners was calling out a fantasy GM. And Moses Madu gets obviously added into the system. And there was Jeremy Zenz, I believe his name was, mentioned that he was looking at add Moses Madu to the lineup, but his commissioner, Derek Putz from Regina, he wanted us to call him out. And he said, Derek is too much of a Scrooge, and he's likely going to steal him. So Derek Putz in Regina, if you're listening to this show, we're telling you right now, don't be a shady commish, man. Derek, just don't be a shady commish. And there was another one that we talked about on Twitter as well, an exchange that I know Dan got involved in.
Yeah, as far as with that, commissioners, let them have the guy. If you don't want to, maybe put it to a coin flip if multiple guys are trying to get them, but it's not showing up on the system. I know in our league, if it's the first guy to call dibs in our group chat gets the player. And in other years, if a guy's coming back from the NFL, we'll do a little bit of a mini draft based on your placement in the standings. So be a fair commissioner. Don't make it where these guys have to come to us and have us call you out on a podcast that goes across North America. It's just not fair to them, and especially to you. If your ego's getting a hit on a podcast, shame on you.
Yeah, and now everybody in North America knows Derek Putz. Derek, don't be a putz. Just don't do it. I'm just telling you right now. See, we're even having fun with your name. And Marco is another guy that was in the same situation on Twitter as well. That's social media. You can follow us at CFL Fantasy FTB, myself at Dave Dawson 7, or Dan, the stats guy, at Dan_UK1. Engineer Ben, who's now wearing the producer hat tonight too, because producer Dan is not feeling well, has literally this entire room packed up, and I'm in a duffel bag. So he's telling me that he wants to get going. So with that being said, I say, are there any final thoughts on the night, Mr. Dan, the stats guy?
None as far as those go. Watch for injuries this week. Watch the lineups. If you haven't got our weekly DFS rankings, get on board with those. OnsideCFL.wordpress.com. We'll have the weekly rankings link available to you on Tuesday afternoon. So watch for it on Tuesday, and we'll get that to you so you can be prepared for Thursday.
All right, Lower Your Weapons by Revolution Engine. As always, engineer Ben's band, and Ben's got a weapon. It looks like a hook. He's trying to pull me out of the room. So we got to get going. We're into week 3 already. Enjoy the games this weekend. Enjoy doubleheader. Happy Independence Day again to our American listeners. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.